Welcome, everybody. This is Mark Pichet, President and CEO of the Conservative Energy Network. Thank you for joining us today. We have an exciting presentation for you, a case study on Wisconsin polling data from surveys both before and after the November election. This is part of a series of polls that CEN has done over the past few months, anchored in a national survey that has been performed that we released in a webinar a week ago. Want to remind everybody that that survey and the data and the webinar itself are available on our website, conservativeenergynetwork.org/polling, or you can link to it on our homepage as well. I'm really excited to turn this over to Scott Coonan, the executive director of the Wisconsin Conservative Energy Forum. Scott is doing a tremendous job leading conservative clean energy engagement in Wisconsin, and doing a fabulous job. And so I'm going to turn this over to Scott to lead the discussion and make some other introductions, and we'll get into the data with Glen Bolger here post haste. So thank you again for joining us.
Thank you, Mark. I appreciate it. And as people kind of cycle in a little bit, but before we start with an introduction of Matt Johnson, our field operations director, and then move into Glen's presentation, everybody feel free to use the Q&A button. Obviously, I think we're all pretty adept at the virtual presentations now, but we want to take some questions from you guys. So please feel free to use the Q&A button. We'll get to questions as we can. Feel free to use that throughout Glen's presentation, and at the end of the presentation, we'll come to some question and answer session between Mark, myself, Glen, and Matt. So I'm hoping that this will be some interesting data. Obviously, we just went through maybe the most divisive election in American history. I'm wondering if there is anything that American voters can agree on. I am wondering if energy is one of those things. I'm also wondering if energy played a role in this election at all, where it ranks in voters' interests. And also broadly, we want to talk with Glen a little bit about where the American electorate is here. Obviously, we didn't get a hard decision point in November, but there's a clear division at almost every level. And I've told people in the past, we live in a divided country, and here in Wisconsin, we are in a very purple divided state, and we live in some divided purple communities right now. So interested to get into things a little bit more with Glen about the role that energy plays in all of this. And for conservatives, for Republicans, I think maybe there's a bit of soul searching here. Having lost the United States House, having lost the United States Senate, and having lost the White House in a midterm year, where do we go from here? And how can we appeal maybe more broadly to a section of voters that I think we all kind of recognize are drifting away from us right now, and that we may very well need. So how do we build that big tent back again? So with that, I'll kind of turn it over to Matt Johnson, our field operations director with Land and Liberty. Matt, I don't know if you want to take a second just to introduce yourself to the group here.
Yeah, thank you, Scott. So I'm the field operations director for our Wisconsin Land and Liberty Coalition. I do community outreach throughout the state of Wisconsin, building education and support for renewable energy, and really excited for this presentation. I think our main messaging on economic growth and economic benefits of solar and wind power and renewable energy we are in a good place, and as well as private property rights message that we share with people across the state. So we're really looking forward to the presentation.
Well, perfect. With that, I guess, Glen, I will turn it over to you, sir, to get into your presentation and start getting into some of these numbers.
Great. Before I start, just want to make sure I just shared screen. I want to make sure everybody can see it. No point in me talking about it if people can't see it. Mark, okay, I got the thumbs up from Mark, so that means, and Scott now, so that means folks can see it, and that's what I was hoping to hear. We did the survey online, 300 actual voters who voted in the November election. The survey was conducted December 16th through the 23rd. Concurrently at that time, we also had a national survey going. That's why the field dates were a little bit extended, because for online polling, it was just easier to do it over the course of thereabouts of a week. Okay, why isn't this? Okay, there we go. I'm not going to spend a ton of time on the political environment. I want to get to the clean energy stuff, which is the most of the survey. But I do want to cover a little bit about the political environment, both before and after. You can see the right direction, wrong track. We were asking about country, but these data are from Illinois. I'm not Illinois, Wisconsin. I'm sorry. And in the middle, there's a box that shows the national average at the time of the first survey, where Wisconsin voters, 32 right direction, 68% wrong track. After the election, it dropped down to 22.78. And there's a very good reason for that. And that is Republicans weren't happy with the outcome of the election. What's interesting, you can see in October, Republicans were at 64% right direction. By the mid-December, they were all down to 30. They were all the way down to 34% right direction. So a big shift there in terms of Republicans' mood. Democrats got a little bit more positive. I guarantee you, if we were to do a survey today, now after the inauguration, that Democrats would probably be about as positive, if not more so, than Republicans were back in October. And you'll also note that independents, their right direction number drops significantly. I'm going to move on. Trump's pretty much old news. What we found was that people reported voting for Biden and Harris 50-48. Biden actually won 50-49. So it was certainly right well within the margin of error. What's important to note is that Republicans obviously very united behind President Trump, Democrats extremely united behind now President Biden, and independents voted for Biden by 4 points, which was enough to be the margin of victory. You'll hear me talk a lot about, when we get into the data, independent voters, because they are the ones who swing elections. When both sides' bases turn out and vote overwhelmingly for their own team, really the deciding group is the one in the middle. It's not a huge group in Wisconsin. It's just under 1 out of every 5 voters, but they're the ones, as you can see from how close the election was, they're the ones who make the decision. So when you afterwards, if you think to yourself, wow, I'm really focused on independence, this is the reason why. They're the ones who swing elections. There's no such thing as a purely base election, except a primary, of course. But general elections are won and lost usually by how independents vote. Let's go right now to domestic energy production. We asked survey respondents whether for each of these different types of energy, whether the United States should put more emphasis, less emphasis, or about the same emphasis that they currently do on these different types. And you can see that wind is at 61 more, 10% less emphasis. Solar power really does well in Wisconsin, 74.6, and then hydropower also does well, 58.5. These are the 3 strongest in Wisconsin. Coal, it has a relatively negative, as you can see. Now it's not quite, it's better than, it's about 4.5 to 1 negative. In other words, 12% say more emphasis, 53% say less emphasis. Not as negative as things were back in October towards coal, but still, when more than half say less emphasis, that's saying a lot. Natural gas tends to be positive by 2 to 1, 40 to 19. And then nuclear power is a net negative 10 points. People just have a lot of concerns about the safety of nuclear power. And that's why it tends to be relatively mixed to negative in people's perceptions of it. Biomass, what's interesting is, there were a lot more voters who had an opinion in October. And by the way, the percent saying same, to me, that's 62%. That's a lot of respondents saying, well, I don't really know much about it, so I'm just going to make the safe choice and go with same. Doesn't mean that in the future it might not become more positive. Clean coal, you saw how negative the reaction was to coal. Clean coal does better. It's a +6. Not a big change from October when it was a +2. And you got about a third of Wisconsinites saying same emphasis. This is looking at it among Republicans. And October, of course, is across the top. December is, I should have said this earlier, but December is the one along the bottom, because the December poll was the most recent poll. As you can see, coal in October was more negative than it is now with Republicans, but still not overly positive. It's -20, 35 less emphasis, 15 more emphasis. Natural gas, pretty much where it was back in October. Now it's 50 more emphasis, 6% less emphasis. Wind does better now than it did in October. Solar does a little bit better. And look at the less emphasis. It dropped 10 points among Republicans from 24 down to 14. Nuclear power was +12, now it's +13. So no real change there. And then hydropower does well with an 8-point drop in the less emphasis, back down to single digits, or not back down to, but down to single digits. Then among independents, you can see, the big winners, wind at 68.3, solar 75.0, and hydropower 58.0. So the less emphasis numbers with them really dropped from the pre-election poll. And, you may wonder why, and that's a good question. I don't have the answer to that. Sometimes you can look at data and say, oh, this happened, or this makes sense, this could explain it. I don't think I have an explainer, especially the shift among wind, going from 50.37 to 68.3. Solar was relatively modest change, and same with hydropower. 14 to 0 is a significant change, but the more emphasis didn't really change that much from 56 to 58. Coal among independents, in the 60s, less emphasis in both polls. Natural gas is doing better in the December, post-election poll than it did in the pre-election poll at 38, 31. But nuclear power doing a little bit worse, 18 more emphasis, 50% less emphasis. Then we asked 4 issues and asked which party would do a better job handling that issue. On the environment, Democrats have a 25-point edge. On energy issues, Democrats have a 9-point edge. Clean energy issues jumps back to 25, and then they have a 31-point advantage on climate change. So the Democrats really have an advantage in this space, a little closer among energy issues. Turning now to clean energy, do you support or oppose the government taking action to accelerate the development and use of clean energy in the U.S.? This is pretty solidly supported across the board. 85%, it was 88% in October. No real change there. And intensity is very important in public opinion. And look at the intensity. Strongly support currently 42%, strongly oppose 4%. So better than 10.5 to 1 to be specific. And then the other rule of thumb on intensity is not just the ratio, but it's also where is it in connection to the 30% line? Because what we found is that issues with 30% or higher, either support or opposition, that's a fair amount of intensity. So whether it was the October 47% or the December 42%, you can see that there is a lot of intensity in support of government taking action. Now, it's not specific, but people are reacting obviously to the concept. Excuse me. And when you look at it by party, by the way, don't worry, I don't have coronavirus. That cough just happened. And guess what? If I do, it's not going to spread through a Zoom meeting to you. So don't worry about it. How about by party? You can see Republicans take government taking action 71%, not quite as high, obviously, the 80% back in October. But this is not a huge difference, even though Democrats are all the way 100%. That's not a huge partisan difference. I mean, when you see big differences on issues, there tends to be like a 60 to 80 point gap. Here, the gap is 29 points. And then look at independents. They're very consistent with October. It was 90% then, 89% now. So when we talk about, okay, how do you win over a few more independents? Clean energy clearly is a good issue for conservative candidates to be able to talk about. Looking at it by gender and age, look, Republicans have challenges with younger voters. They're more supportive. Although again, we're not talking about big differences. I mean, older men, for example, 81% support that. Then we asked, okay, of the different ways to increase clean energy production, which would you prefer? And approaches like competition and allow markets and businesses to provide more clean energy production, 71%. Government mandates, subsidies, and quotas, 17%. Or a price or tax put on carbon emissions, 12%. So that 71 obviously dwarfs. And guess what that 71% is? That's the Republican approach. That's what conservative candidates can talk about. So yes, Democrats do extremely well on kind of the, hey, should we be for clean energy or not? Yes, Democrats are more supportive of that. But when you talk about, okay, how do we do this? What we find is that the public is very supportive of Republican approaches. That's competition, it's business driven and market driven as opposed to government driven. And when you look at it by party, on the competition, 93% of Republicans favor that, 69% of independents, and even 49% of Democrats. Now, look, you're not going to win 49% of Democratic voters over with that messaging, but it may get a few more. And anything that puts a strain on their coalition is a good thing. The more important one, of course, is independents at 69%. How important is it that a candidate for political office shares your opinion on clean energy? 69% say it's important. That's down a bit from 74% in October. And where the drop really came was 8 points among the percentage saying very important. And I think, look, let's be frank. Sorry, I was reminded of the "Don't Call Me Shirley" line from Airplane. Don't call me Frank. But there were huge issues, other issues. So the fact that the voters are saying, yeah, 24% say, yeah, it's very important. That's credible and believable, given coronavirus, given the economy, given the controversies over the president's personality and how he handled people, and especially those he didn't like. It's obviously, and this looks at the percentage total important, I should say. Republicans had dropped, but still a majority. Independents, pretty consistent at 62% compared to 61% going into it. Same with Democrats. So the only change came with Republicans, but even there, it's a majority. So it's saying that, and it's not like this issue, and we've seen it so many different times, it hurts Republican candidates with Republican voters in a general election. What it tries to do and is capable of doing is attracting independent voters. Thinking about clean energy, would you vote for or against elected officials or candidates who support clean energy development like solar and wind, or would it make no difference to your vote? 62% said they would vote for, 10% against, and 28% say, yeah, it makes no difference. And the definite's 25%, a little bit low, but the definite for, I should say, the definite against is just 3%. So this is not, clean energy is not any kind of negative that's going to turn off huge chunks of your base. It's just not, the data is just not there. And the other point of this is the campaigns that they have used this issue, it didn't hurt them with their base. Support among independents has dipped a bit, but still 50% for, only 7% against. Republicans, you can see it's a little bit better than 2-1 in terms of being a positive as opposed to them saying against. And keep in mind, you know, what you're doing a campaign when you're talking about clean energy is you're also talking about other issues. And one of those other issues is the difference between Republicans and Democrats on regulation, taxes, so many other different issues that, you know, that 18% who are a little wary of it, you know, what we should be able to do is convince them, oh, okay, I might not be thrilled with the Republican on this issue, but by golly, they're a heck of a lot better than any Democratic candidate on all the other issues. We asked about electric vehicle, and this is obviously kind of a shift in the questioning. A third say that when they make their next vehicle purchase, they're likely to consider purchasing one. 4% say very likely, 28% say somewhat likely. Not too surprisingly, when you look at who's most likely to say they're likely, it tends to be Democrats. You know, when you look at it by age, tends to be a little bit younger, also not surprising. And then in terms of nuclear energy, 59% agree that it should be included and prioritized as part of the country's clean energy mix. Now, keep in mind, you're saying, well, wait a minute, Glenn, you showed me data earlier that people were, you know, said there should be less emphasis on nuclear energy than there is now. Whoops, sorry about that. I'm having an issue with my screen and I don't know how to make it better. Let me go back. Here we were. But, you know, people are thinking, I think when people react to nuclear energy overall, they're thinking more about safety, 3 Mile Island, for example. But here, when you indicate that it's part of the clean energy mix, oh, well, you know, I need to think about that. Now, keep in mind, only 18% strongly agree, only 14% strongly disagree. So that underscores to me that those who are supportive of nuclear energy as part of the clean energy mix need to make a pretty strong case for it, because that suggests that voters themselves aren't certain. Republicans are more supportive at 65%, more likely to agree with that, I should say. Independents are more split, and Democrats, interestingly, didn't change from October to December. Also, a majority agree with that statement. Turning now to climate change, we asked how important the issue was to their vote. 44% say it's important. Before the election, 66% said it was going to be important. I think this shows that there's kind of some honesty coming through there. Again, we had a lot of big issues on the table this year. Climate change was a part of the campaign discussion, but not obviously as dominant as the economy or COVID or, you know, a number of other issues out there. It was certainly more important to Democrats, independents, and Republicans. Big change when, you know, pre-election to post-election in terms of how important that vote, that issue is. Tends to be more important among younger rather than older, especially older men. They're most likely to say it's not important. Moving on to government taking, favor opposed government taking steps to reduce the emissions of gases like carbon dioxide and methane emissions that cause global climate change. You can see both pre-election and post-election opinion is relatively similar. 81% in December, 79% favor in October. Intensity dropped a little bit to 36%, but again, the overall number moved up too, and it's, you know, still fairly strong at 36%. Not surprisingly, Democrats more likely to support, but you have 86% of independents and even 64% of Republicans. You know, again, we're not seeing opposition from big opposition from Republicans. And when we're talking about, okay, how do we get independents to pay attention to Republican candidates? Clean energy is clearly one way that independents will say, oh, I should take a look at this candidate because they're not what I expect out of a Republican on reduced emissions or any kind of clean energy type issues. I'll skip over that one just in the interest of getting sooner to the Q&A. But then we asked a four-part question about climate change. Slight shift from October to December, but not an overall one. But climate change is an extreme threat, 38%, that's the plurality. It's a threat to be considered, 33%. So when you add those up, it's 71% who's considered a threat. 20% say it's a minor threat, 9% say nope, not at all. So how do you handle it? Assuming it's caused by, climate change is caused by humans, research, development, and innovation comes in 28%, and improving market structure and incentives to allow clean energy technologies to more fairly compete, 19%. So pretty significant top two, coming in at 47% combined with, again, Republican-oriented messages and options. In other words, the generalized is Democratic, but the specifics, people opt for Republican solutions to clean energy and climate change and what have you. And keep in mind, when you say, well, 47% is not a majority, but 34% also cite all of, do pick all of the above. So when you add up kind of the Democratic approach, which would be Paris climate, phasing out fossil fuels, and increased regulations, they only add up to 20%. Do you approve or disapprove of the job the Republican Party is doing addressing climate change? 44 approve, 56% disapprove. You can see the intensity is strongly against at 41, disapproving to 19, strongly approving. Not a big change from October. Not surprisingly, Republicans much more likely to approve. Even, by the way, if they can't tell you what Republican Party is doing. Hey, that's the Republican Party. I'm a Republican, therefore I approve. Independents, that's where the rubber meets the road. Only 26% approve. And that's a group that really is important to us in the last election. Didn't do as well as we needed to, and really important to us in the next election. More likely, less likely to support a Republican candidate who embraces an innovation-based approach to addressing climate change. You see 67% more likely, very similar to the October numbers. Now, intensity is low. That's because you still have to fill in the blanks. Sounds good to people, that's why they're 67% more likely, but you got to make the sale. We're Republicans, a lot of times we're presumed guilty, or conservatives were presumed guilty on this. And that's why a lot of that language and specific policy ideas that we're going to get to, the language I already showed you about research and development, innovation, market-based approaches, those sorts of things are important, as well as having specific policy ideas. Would your view of congressional Republicans be more favorable or less favorable if they embrace the conservative approach to addressing clean energy by prioritizing technology, innovation, and competition? 73% more favorable. Again, intensity is soft, only 13% much more favorable. But first of all, you're asking Democrats this question, and it's hard for them to admit it. Yeah, that I'd be more favorable. The other thing is, again, going back to my point about specifics, we need a lot more specifics to fill in the details. You look at it by party, and you see Republicans like it, 88-12. Independents, 62%. I guarantee you there's not, well, I shouldn't say that. Outside of base-based Democratic areas, there's not an election in the country that Republicans wouldn't win if they were getting 62% of the independent vote. Not that this would automatically get you there, but it's clearly a major step, a positive help. A lot of times on issues, you find independents are pretty well split, like 50-50. And yes, Democrats, 62%. Doesn't mean they're going to be more favorable to the Republican Party, but it does show that maybe the kind of anger and resentment that we've seen in politics wouldn't be quite as strong among Democrats. Let me move on. More likely or less likely to support a candidate for public office who believes human activity is contributing to climate change. 69% more likely, down from October. Intensity is down as well to 23%. But again, that 69% is fairly significant. And look at the much less likely, it's only 7%. So it's not a huge trade-off. It's a negative with Republicans in the post-election survey, not in the pre-election. You see it at 62-38, and doesn't mean, you know, again, this is why I keep talking about independents. You would want to target this message with independents, particularly on this, you know, assuming your candidate is supportive of doing something about climate change. Electricity, given the unpreparedness for a coronavirus pandemic, how important is it that we begin taking steps to protect our electricity grid from disaster? 95% say it's important, including 59% very important. So, you know, again, it's fairly, you know, it's not something people focus on that much, but when they do think about it, it's like, yeah, okay, we got to do something about that. Moving on to policy proposals on clean energy. We tested 9 specific policy proposals. Hold on a second. Oh, sorry. New laptop, so I'm not used to where the page up and page down buttons are, so I apologize. Okay, here we go. Look at the total percentage. You know, these are in the 80s and 90s, and then the intensity are in the 30s and 40s, going as high as 48% strongly favor. I'm not going to read each one of you, but these are good Republican or conservative, I guess is a better way to put it, since it's the conservative energy network. Conservative solutions to help expand their state's commitment to clean energy. Now, here's some more. These didn't test quite as well, but we're talking still total in the 80s, 70s, 169. Look, the lowest one here is the carbon capture and storage. And look at how much longer it is than the other languages. I'll even go back to the other one so you can look. And I think this is, you know, the reason the intensity is so low and the opposition is a little bit higher too. Whoa, you know, this is a new concept to people. They have no idea what it means. So they're a little, you know, you'll see a bit more reluctance here than on lots of other things. Support or oppose, you know, in terms of proposals to help expand clean energy in the US. This was a different sequence, but again, similar things to look at. What's the total and what's the intensity? Not quite as high on the intensity, but these are less specific and a little bit more generalized. You can see the tax, changing the tax system and taxing carbon-based fuels, not nearly as strong as some of the other ideas. Then we asked them to indicate how important each of these are, varies somewhat, not at all, you know, not very important. And these are the totals. And this involves protecting property owners' rights, essentially. Slightly different wording, a slightly different approach, but again, you're getting to 87 and 89% overall. Turning now to message testing, we gave both sides of a number of different arguments. And the one thing that's important in this is you want to be as fair as possible to both sides in terms of the wording. So as you read through this, hopefully you'll say, yeah, okay, that's, you know, what the supporters say and what the opponents say or what have you. You can see people are very split on whether owners of electric vehicles should have to pay gas taxes or some sort of tax to subsidize the cost of charging stations, and then also obviously maintenance for roads and highways that they also use. So people are pretty evenly divided on that. Net metering comes out 61-39 in support. keep in mind, excuse me, sorry about that. That's what happens when you are old and you ski in the morning and then do a Zoom. You say, I'm a little tired. I feel good though. Hopefully I won't yawn again. But again, net metering, keep in mind, a lot of respondents, this is the first they've ever heard of net metering. And you can see that, at the top there, there's the introductory paragraph that goes in, a description of net metering. Then we asked about renewable energy development in rural landscapes, mostly wind and solar. Supporters say it's good, boosting income of farmers, helping them survive financially and maintain their family farm. Some, and then the opponents say it's bad because they ruin beautiful views, kill birds, and take good farmland out of production. That one's not even close at 80 to 20. Then we asked a couple of different questions about adding additional options for purchasing electricity, more about choice, and not surprisingly, choice in America, when it comes to consumer choices, tests extremely highly. So overwhelming numbers there. And by the way, one last point. See down at the bottom left, as you're looking at your screen, references split samples. That means, half the people replied to one, the other half approximately applied to the other. Then we asked a series of agree, disagree statements, a total of 5. Get back to that. Sorry, I just wanted to make sure that I hadn't forgotten that there was another page of it, and as it turns out, there isn't. Agree, disagree statements. Again, intensity is a little bit on the lower side, but we do have some in the mid 30s. But look at the overall numbers, 91, 81, 75. By the way, in case you're wondering why it's 75 is higher than the 84 and 81 is higher than the 84, it's because we we ranked it on the percentage who strongly agree. And then, okay, this is what's called an informed ballot. Now that you've heard more, you support or oppose government taking action to accelerate the development and use of clean energy. 81% support. Before, when we asked this question earlier in the survey, it was 85%. You say, well, wait a minute, Glenn. All these people say, yeah, I like this, I support that. But they're also getting bombarded with lots of different information. And there might be one thing that moves it down a little bit. Keep in mind that the difference between 85% and 81% is not that significant. You're still talking overwhelming support and less than 1 out of 5 opposing. Then we asked, sorry, that question, something we were saving for something else that should have been pulled out. So that's the survey presentation in a nutshell. I would turn it back to Scott, I believe, is going to be moderating the Q&A.
Thanks, Glenn. I know Scott's having some technical difficulties where he is, so I'm going to jump in and lead this for a moment, and hopefully Scott can get better connected here. But first question I have, Glenn, is that independents broke towards Biden in Wisconsin and clearly made the difference in getting him over the top. What does an independent voter look like in Wisconsin? Who are the independent voters in the state?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, look, it's hard to really put a demographic profile. It's more issues. In other words, they tend to be a little bit more fiscally conservative, tend to be a little bit more socially liberal, and independents tend to split on a lot of issues about 50-50. In other words, if Republicans support an issue 80-20 and Democrats oppose it 20-80, independents tend to be somewhere in the middle on that issue. So it's hard to pigeonhole them because there's some conservative independents and there's some liberal independents, and they tend to vote one way most of the time. But there's enough of them who are up for grabs that make the difference between winning and losing the state, and that's kind of who you have to dial into.
Absolutely. No, thank you. And, one of the observations that I've made on this poll, and frankly, most of our polling has been pretty consistent on this point, and that is that voters seem to like the left's aspirational goals when it comes to clean energy and climate, but they are more comforted with a conservative approach based on principles like free markets, less government, um, states' rights. Um, uh, what's your reaction to that that assessment that I guess I've made looking at the data? Is that something you agree with, Glenn?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're spot on. I think I tried to make the point earlier, but some of the reason I made that point, which is they like the Republican specifics and language. They like the Democratic aspiration. And by the way, there's no reason that conservatives and Republicans need to just surrender that aspiration. I mean, particularly if you're for clean energy, it's very easy to talk about market driven research, development, innovation. That's Republican, and that leads to it's the Republican approach, and that leads to more use of clean energy, less costly use of clean energy as well. So yeah, I think, and Mark and not to give away any secrets, but Mark and I had talked about this, when the data came back and all of that. So I think the data is in agreement with that, and we're both in agreement on that.
Yeah, and to me, what it suggests is that the electorate doesn't, and even conservatives don't want fellow conservatives to be just, Larry David here. It's not just curb your enthusiasm, but rather this is about conservatives actually getting involved in the creation of policy. Not only do we as conservatives believe that that's the right approach, but middle America seems to agree with that too.
Yeah, and let me go back to, and Mark, you've heard this before, but obviously not everybody has. Kind of my conversion on clean energy as a good political issue for Republicans, a good way to reach out to independents, and that's going back 11 years to Bob McDonnell, who was the last statewide elected official to win in Virginia as a Republican. And he was elected governor. And one of the ads that we tested was him talking about an all of the above energy policy, including for Virginia, including wind and solar, and to be the leader in the Southeast on clean energy issues. And we tested it with independents, and it was one of the best, if not the best ad I think I've ever tested with independents in terms of how people responded to it. Well, Bob was understandably a little nervous that, hey, this might turn off the base. So for the first time in a general election, I did focus groups with base Republicans and tested the ad with them. And they loved it. They thought it was great. And I asked them, well, to explain why they responded so positively to it. And they're like, look, we can't go to 100% clean energy right now, but it's the future. If you think that oil and gas is the only option, you're literally a dinosaur. Somebody, made that joke, which I appreciate. But, so this is the future. We're not there to be 100% yet, but we're headed in, that direction. So Republican voters, base Republican voters say, look, change is coming. We have to, understand it and be for it. So I think it's a really strong, credible message for Republican candidates to use.
Scott, are you able to chime in here? Would love to hear your thoughts on the application in Madison.
Yeah, so I hope everybody can hear me fairly well. And I'm back at it here for a second, hopefully. Glenn, I guess maybe there's a difference between your polling data and popular culture or what we hear every day. Maybe it seems to me that the media is focusing on 5% of each side's base right now, because I guess it seems to me like, the way forward on this is both left and right seem to understand that, center right and center left voters seem to understand there should be a conservative policy applied to this not traditional conservative area of renewable or clean energy. but I don't get the feeling, at least in popular culture and in political culture, that either base Democrats or base Republicans actually want to see that happen. So your numbers say that the Republican base is more or less on board, or kind of, laissez-faire about this issue. But I hear a lot from activists that they're not. And the term rhino gets thrown around a lot, or not conservative, or something like that. And this is somebody who's open to climate change or open to clean energy or renewable energy gets you branded with the rhino sticker really, really quickly, I feel like, by party activists or base activists. So are there some numbers in here that don't, is there 5% on each side of the aisle that's driving this conversation essentially?
Well, I don't know so much about the Democratic side. That's not who I'm focused on. I don't really worry about winning too many of those voters over, because it's really hard to do. I focus much more on Republicans. And what these data underscore is it's not on every issue and not on every construct, but for the most part, Republicans support more clean energy, more use of it. There is openness on climate change, particularly if it is a Republican approach of research, development, innovation, as opposed to, one of the challenges that Republicans have is a lot of people, Republicans, when they think of clean energy, they reach all the way back to Solyndra, for example, where government's picking winners and losers. But if we talk about it, the market picking winners and losers, and protecting private property rights, for example, we showed those two questions that Mark wisely inserted into the October survey. And that has strong support from Republicans. So a lot of it is in the construct of how you frame it, where you want to get to the specifics right away and get to the Republican, the conservative approach right away, as opposed to trying to win the argument on, we need to do something about climate change and clean energy. It's more, here's ways to do that. And by the way, having more options for energy, that's a good thing. More choice. We saw how well choice works, for example, on electricity providers. So I think my point is that there is a lot of different avenues to take, and Republicans are much more open to certain ones than they are to others.
And if I can add to that too, and because we've got a number of other questions here that have come in also dealing with this, specifically, how does a Republican candidate navigate the issue with its base, and then also, with independents in a general election? One of the things that I would comment on that, and would love to hear other thoughts as well, is that, there's a mistake about viewing conservatism monolithically. And, particularly after the events that transpired at the Capitol on January 6th, conservatives like us are very keen on creating some separation between those kinds of reactionaries and constitutional conservatives who would never dream of that kind of an activity. So, but, when I look at conservatives, I think it's important as a candidate to meet folks where they are on this issue. So if someone is responsive to the religious messaging that, it's important to be good stewards, that there are conservatives who respond to that. There are conservatives who respond to the jobs messaging more acutely. There are conservatives who respond to economic development or property rights. And what's important for us as conservatives in this work is to parse conservatism so that we can assign messages to conservative constituencies that are going to be most responsive. And I should add messengers to that, messages and messengers that are going to be most effective. But Glenn, Scott, any other thoughts on that?
I'd actually kick it over to Matt for a second. Matt, you spend a lot of time talking to local landowners around, renewable energy projects, putting steel in the ground, on some of these real projects. What's the message that resonates with, traditionally farmers, kind of red state country folks in Wisconsin? What do you think the message in your experience is that really resonates and kind of gets through on some of these issues?
Yeah, I definitely think the messaging of private property rights of farmers and landowners being able to develop their property is really well received in rural areas that I've spoken to, as well as the economic benefits. When these farmers and landowners find out that if they lease their land with a major project, they can get a guaranteed revenue stream for decades. They can diversify their income, expand their business, stay in business even. It's incredibly helpful. So I honestly reiterate those economic benefits every conversation I have almost, that land lease payments to farmers and landowners can keep them in business, help their communities. These projects have construction jobs and other types of jobs, and there's revenue that comes into counties and towns. So I believe solar and wind is very popular in a lot of rural Wisconsin. And so that's a lot of what I do, is answering those questions.
Well,
Well, we've got another.
go ahead, Scott, take over.
Yeah, Glenn, we've got another question here I think is interesting on, electric vehicles. Have you done any, any further, any further polling on the messages around electric vehicles, or, how Republican state legislators, policymakers might be able to, more fully embrace that issue? It seems like, at least to me, that there's not quite the partisan, breakdown sometimes over that issue. But have you done any polling on those messages?
Scott, real quick before I answer that, there is a question about the confidence interval. On online surveys, they're actually called credibility interval, and the credibility interval is plus minus 6.45% on this survey. So just wanted to get that question answered, because I skipped over that when I was doing the methodology, because again, I had problems with the up down buttons, and now I've got that in theory mastered. But to answer your question, no, I have not done additional polling on electric vehicles. We can certainly do a search for other pollsters, usually public polls that have done it. And it's also, by the way, a good argument to make to Mark that we should do additional polling on this. Pollsters always like additional polling.
Yeah, this is a thorny issue because again, Republicans have no aversion to electric vehicles, particularly in response to market demand, but how we fund it, how we seed that money, how we pay for the infrastructure that supports electric vehicles, which is unique. That's where, I urge conservatives to be part of the discussion to ensure that we get an endurable policy that doesn't swing back and forth with regime change. And, let's get this right now and not keep, overhauling it every 2 years.
Is there any indication, Glenn, in your polling at all, and Mark, actually, maybe feel free to talk about this as well. Any indication? So obviously it seems like center or center right policy is really popular, broadly popular with left, right, middle independent voters. Is there any indication on Green New Deal or some of the other more highly partisan, policy solutions to this problem? Any indication that the Democrats paid a price at the ballot box for Green New Deal messaging, or, some of the more left kind of ideas out there in the sphere?
We didn't test Green New Deal specifically on this poll, but certainly have tested it on many others. And what you find is, if you just say Green New Deal, people say, yeah, that sounds pretty good. There's a lot of support for it. If that's something that you're wanting to knock down, opposed to as a candidate or a legislative staffer or what have you, you got to work the specifics to people. You got to tell them what it would do. And what you find is that as you go into what it does, people's attitudes change. You know, like we do a kind of a pre and post question. The pre-question, favor or oppose, might be 65%, 70%. You know, we all throw around Green New Deal like everybody should know about it. And, you know, we find out that's just not the case. But then when we say, okay, are some of the outcomes of it, and we include some positives. So, you know, some of what the Democrats say would come from the Green New Deal. It's not just all negative, but support drops to, you know, much more of a 50-50 level when they hear both pros and cons, because instead of it just being a, you know, oh, that's a pretty good name, Green New Deal, I guess I'm for that. It's more of the, oh, there's some not so good things in here. There's some good things, but not so good things as well. So it's important to define the Green New Deal.
I would just add to that, Scott, that I think the biggest indicator of a cautionary approach, even on the left towards the Green New Deal, is that Biden didn't adopt it. I mean, he created his own energy plan to create specifically separation between himself and the Green New Deal. So, I mean, the Green New Deal is popular on the fringe left. It has very little traction outside of there. And, that's where it's just a bridge too far for most Americans. And, a more pragmatic approach has a better chance of seeing some action than the Green New Deal. But I think you're right, Scott. I think Democrats did pay a price for it. If you look at the results of the election below the federal level, where the results were based more on policy than personality politics, Republicans did well, conservatives did well at every level, local, state. There is a thirst for bipartisan solutions among the middle of the electorate. As Glenn pointed out earlier, the extremes want to take no prisoners. They don't want any, compromise is a dirty word. But most of America wants compromise, and they want to see it, as Glenn said, and if you said, move more to the right in terms of the policy constructs that support that clean energy direction.
Perfect. And I won't, I think we're about an hour in now, so I guess I won't keep anybody too much longer. I did have one more question real quick, just on the polling industry in general, Glenn. And I won't ask you to defend other people's work necessarily, but it is a question on my mind. I will give you the last 3 polls before the general election at the state level here in Wisconsin: +10 Biden, +8, and +8. And we all know the final election result here was within a percentage point, about a half a percentage point. What's wrong with polling in this country right now? And how are we going to fix it going forward?
Oh, look, we're out of time. No, I'd say I'd be happy to answer the question, but I will answer that question. And by the way, I think, isn't Wisconsin the state where the Washington Post ABC news poll had it 17 points for Biden? Am I right on that? Yeah. So I'm actually shocked you didn't mention that one.
Maybe.
And by the way, there are sometimes
maybe a month and a half out from election day. We thought
was it that far? I'll tell you what. When I saw that, there are sometimes I've taken a survey for a client, usually a candidate, and I've said, look, I just don't believe these results. Let's throw this out. There's nothing that reflects this. We're going to throw this out and redo the survey at no extra charge, because we got to have confidence in these numbers to make decisions. And that, by the way, the 17 point, that was an example where they shouldn't have even reported that. They should have just thrown it out and redone it. Or if they didn't have the money to redo it, because polls are expensive, especially these days, just thrown it out and pretended they never had done it. It's irresponsible to do that one. Going back to the others, look, our data was pretty accurate. My clients were very happy with the results. We had Tom Tillis had moved into a very, very slight lead in our last survey, margin of error clearly more, about a 1-point advantage. And he won at the same time that everybody else was saying, no, Cunningham is going to win that. That's just one example. There were 2 surveys that I felt. One was from early October in a state legislative race where the results underestimated the Republican percentage by way too much, the survey results compared to the actual election results. And then there was another one where, again, we had the Republican trailing most of the time, and he ended up winning close margin. But again, I felt like that one, we weren't quite as on point as we would have liked to have been. Unfortunately, in states like the Georgia Senate elections, we were right on the mark. Arizona, those we were polling for super PACs. But candidates, talked to a number of candidates who said, wow, your industry's in trouble. Your poll for me was right. Your polling for me was right, but your industry's in trouble. And I'm like, well, I can only control what I do. Look, I think there are several things. One is, I think, when you look at Trump voters in particular, there's evidence that they were reluctant to take surveys. We asked a few questions, for example, on our election night survey. We do it, and there were a significant percentage of Trump voters who said that they did not tell other people how they were voting because, they didn't want to get yelled at or, cancel cultured, I guess is another way to put it. I think that's a factor. Does it continue going forward? I don't know. I will say this, 2018, when Trump was not on the ballot, the data was very accurate. So is it a Trump phenomena? I don't know. We'll find out. But, most of the Republican pollsters I've talked to since the election felt good about their own data. So I think there were certainly challenges with media surveys. And obviously, Scott, I believe that's probably what you were citing, the 10, 8, and 8, as well as obviously that 17. But yeah, it is challenging. Every election, we take a look and say, okay, what can we do better? It's harder to get people to answer calls. You see a significant increase in the cost of polling simply because, again, you got to dial that many more people to get people to respond. 2022, is it going to be more like 2018, where the data is very accurate, or is it going to be more like 2020, where Trump voters are reluctant to participate in polls? I don't know. We're going to find out. We'll do our level best.
All right, I appreciate it, sir. Thank you. It's a gotcha, I know, but
Hey,
but I appreciate it.
We have it. It's part of part of what's out there. I mean, it's there. So no, it's not a gotcha. Don't worry about it. Thanks.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate it, Mark, Glenn, Matt, everybody. Thank you guys for taking a little time with us here, and I appreciate everybody on the panel and everybody for tuning in as well. So thank you guys much.
Thank you. And just a reminder to everybody that the polling data is I think it's on the YSEF page as well as the CEN page. Is that true, Scott?
Yep.
Okay. So you can get on both the Wisconsin Conservative Energy Forum or the CEN websites. We also have recorded the webinar today, so that recording will be made available as soon as we can. We'll let everybody who participated in this call know. We've got your email addresses. So thank you for joining us.
It won't be ready until I cut Scott's last question.
That's right. So I just, on behalf of CEN and our partners and our amazing Wisconsin Conservative Energy Forum and Wisconsin Land and Liberty Coalition teams, thank you for joining us. And we look forward to working with everybody on a very eventful 2021. So thank you, everyone.
Thanks.